Picture yourself standing in what is now East Africa, but this isn't the landscape you'd recognize today. The air shimmers with heat that makes the Amazon rainforest feel like a gentle spring day. Towering trees stretch endlessly in every direction, their canopies so thick that sunlight barely penetrates to the forest floor below. This is Earth 5.8 million years ago, and if you think surviving one day in the medieval period was impossible, try lasting 5 minutes in this primordial nightmare where everything, and I mean everything, is trying to kill you. Welcome to the late Miocene epoch, where your ancestors didn't just fight for survival against the elements or disease. They fought giants, actual giants. We're talking about creatures so massive, so terrifyingly powerful, that they make modern predators look like house pets. And somehow, impossibly, our early human relatives not only survived this hellscape, but thrived in it. They developed tools, strategies, and social structures that would eventually lead to us sitting here today, probably complaining about our Wi-Fi being slow. Before we dive into this incredible story of survival against impossible odds, hit that like button if you're genuinely fascinated by human evolution, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing our global community come together to explore these ancient mysteries. Now settle in, maybe grab a snack, because we're about to journey back to a time when being human meant something completely different than it does today. You've just opened your eyes in the year 3,800,000 BCE, and congratulations, you're one of our earliest ancestors. The bad news? You're about 3.5 feet tall. You've got the brain size of a modern chimpanzee, and you're surrounded by predators that would make a great white shark run screaming back to the ocean. Your name, if scientists were around to give you one, would be Australopithecus afarensis, though you're probably more concerned with not becoming something's breakfast than worrying about taxonomic classification. The world you've awakened in defies every assumption we have about prehistoric life. This isn't some barren savanna dotted with the occasional acacia tree. This is a lush, humid paradise that stretches from horizon to horizon. But paradise has a dark side, and in this case that dark side has very large teeth and an appetite for small bipedal primates who think they're clever. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight or sound of this ancient world. It's the smell. Rich, earthy, alive in a way that modern environments can't match. The air is thick with the scent of decomposing vegetation, exotic flowers, and something else. Something musky and dangerous that makes every instinct you have scream at you to find shelter immediately. Your body is a marvel of evolutionary compromise. You can walk upright, a revolutionary adaptation that gives you advantages over your purely arboreal cousins. But you're not fully committed to terrestrial life yet. Your arms are longer than a modern human's, your hands are stronger, and you can still scramble up a tree with impressive speed when something large and hungry comes looking for lunch. And trust me, in this world, something is always looking for lunch. Standing on your knuckles and surveying your domain, you notice the sounds first. This isn't the relatively quiet forest of today's Africa. This is a symphony of life, but not the peaceful kind. Somewhere in the distance, something roars with a sound so deep and powerful that you feel it in your chest. Birds screech overhead, but these aren't ordinary birds. Some of them have wingspans that could shadow a small car, and they're not interested in eating seeds and berries. The trees themselves are giants, ancient specimens that have been growing for centuries. Their trunks so wide that it would take dozens of your kind holding hands to encircle them. But they're not just beautiful. They're your highways, your apartment buildings, and often your last line of defense against the horrors that stalk the forest floor. Step is calculated. Your feet, not quite. As you begin to move through this primordial landscape, every human but no longer purely ape navigate roots and fallen branches with surprising grace. But grace won't save you from what's coming. Because 5.8 million years ago, Africa wasn't just home to early humans. It was home to megafauna that would give you nightmares if you could survive long enough to sleep. Let's talk about your neighbors. And by neighbors, I mean the creatures that consider you a convenient snack. First up, Agriotherium, a bear that makes modern grizzlies look like teddy bears. We're talking about an animal that could weigh up to 900 pounds, with claws longer than your fingers, and a bite force that could crush bones like potato chips. These weren't the hibernating, honey-loving bears of children's stories. These were apex predators that hunted actively and had no fear of your kind. But Agriotherium was just the opening act. The real star of this prehistoric horror show was Machairodus, a saber-toothed cat that embodied every nightmare your species would ever have about being hunted. Picture a modern lion, then add 200 pounds of muscle, fangs the length of kitchen knives, and an attitude that suggested it took hunting personally. These cats didn't just kill for food, they seemed to enjoy the process. And then there were the hyenas. Not the relatively modest scavengers we know today, but Percrocuta gigantea, hyenas the size of modern bears, with jaws powerful enough to crack the thigh bone of an elephant. They hunted in packs, they were intelligent, and they had absolutely no respect for the fact that you were supposedly the future of evolution. But perhaps the most terrifying of all your predatory neighbors was Dinophilis, the false saber-toothed cat. Fossil evidence suggests these creatures specialized in hunting early human ancestors. Specialized, as in, you and your relatives were their preferred menu item. They were perfectly sized to hunt primates, intelligent enough to plan ambushes, and strong enough to drag their prey up into trees where they could feed undisturbed. Your daily routine isn't about self-actualization or finding your purpose. It's about not dying. You wake up before dawn, not because you're an early riser, but because the darkness provides cover for movement. The first hour of your day is spent listening, watching, testing the air for scents that might indicate danger. Only when you're reasonably confident that nothing is actively hunting you do you begin the serious business of finding food. Foraging in this environment requires skills that would impress modern special forces. You need to know which fruits are ripe, which roots are safe to dig up, and which insects provide the protein your developing brain desperately needs. But more importantly, you need to know how to do all of this while remaining constantly alert for threats. Your hands, those remarkable evolutionary developments that would eventually build pyramids and paint masterpieces, are currently focused on more immediate concerns, stripping bark from trees to access the nutritious cambium layer beneath. Cracking nuts with rocks, though you haven't quite figured out how to modify those rocks into better tools yet. Digging for tubers with sticks, always aware that the rustling you're making might attract unwanted attention. But you're not entirely defenseless. Your brain, though small by modern standards, is already showing signs of the intelligence that will eventually dominate this planet. You're learning to recognize patterns. You know that certain bird calls mean predators are nearby. You understand that following game trails increases your chances of finding water, but also increases your chances of encountering the things that hunt at water sources. Most importantly, you're not alone. Early humans survived because they were social creatures. Your group, probably numbering between 15 and 30 individuals, represents your insurance policy against extinction. Together, you can post sentries while others forage. You can share information about where the best food sources are located. And when something large and toothy comes calling, you can work together to drive it off, or at least ensure that someone escapes to warn the others. Communication at this stage is primitive but effective. You don't have language as we understand it, but you have an impressive vocabulary of grunts, gestures, and expressions that can convey complex information. The grunt that means saber-toothed cat approaching from the east is very different from the one that means found fruit tree, come quickly. Your survival depends on this communication network, and everyone in your group is fluent in the dialect of staying alive. Your tools are simple but revolutionary. Sticks for digging, stones for cracking nuts, branches for defense. You haven't yet learned to shape these tools deliberately, but you're beginning to understand that some rocks work better than others, that certain sticks are more effective for certain tasks. This is the dawn of technology, though at the moment it's more about immediate survival than long-term innovation. Water is life, but water is also danger. The streams and water holes that sustain you are also magnets for every predator in the region. Approaching water requires careful planning. You send scouts ahead. You choose your timing carefully, avoiding the dawn and dusk hours when big cats prefer to hunt. You drink quickly and retreat immediately, never lingering long enough to become comfortable. But even with all these precautions, encounters are inevitable. The fossil record tells us that many of your contemporaries didn't make it. Skull fragments bearing the distinctive puncture marks of saber-tooth fangs. Bone fragments that show evidence of being cracked open by powerful jaws. Your ancestors lived in a world where violent death was not just possible, but probable. Yet here's the remarkable thing about this story. Despite being small, despite being relatively defenseless, despite living in a world populated by creatures specifically adapted to hunt them, early humans didn't just survive, they began to thrive. They developed strategies that would eventually turn them from prey into predators, from victims into the dominant species on Earth. The key to this transformation wasn't individual strength or speed. It was cooperation, intelligence, and an almost supernatural ability to adapt. When faced with a saber-toothed cat, a single early human was dinner. But a coordinated group of early humans, armed with sticks and stones and the willingness to work together, could drive off predators much larger than themselves. They learned to use fire, though not to create it yet. Lightning strikes and natural fires provided opportunities to grab burning branches. And these torches became powerful weapons against creatures that had evolved in darkness. Imagine being a night-hunting predator, perfectly adapted for stealth kills in complete darkness, suddenly faced with prey that carried their own miniature suns. They learned to use terrain to their advantage. Narrow passages where larger predators couldn't maneuver effectively, rocky outcroppings that provided defensive positions, tree networks that allowed for rapid escape routes that ground-dwelling hunters couldn't follow. Most importantly, they learned to think strategically. Instead of simply reacting to threats, they began to anticipate them. They developed basic tactics, simple but effective strategies for dealing with different types of predators. The response to a stalking cat was different from the response to a charging bear, and your ancestors learned these distinctions through trial and error, with error often meaning death. This wasn't just survival, this was the beginning of warfare. Not warfare as we understand it, between competing human groups, but warfare between species. Early humans versus the megafauna that saw them as food. And slowly, incredibly, the tide was beginning to turn, but the giants weren't going down without a fight. And in our next part, we'll explore the epic battles that shaped our evolution, the incredible strategies our ancestors developed to fight creatures 10 times their size, and the moment when everything changed. When the hunted became the hunters, and the future of our species was decided not through evolution alone, but through intelligence, cooperation, and sheer stubborn refusal to become extinct. The war between early humans and the giants of prehistory was just beginning, and the outcome was far from certain. Your first real encounter with one of these prehistoric giants happens on what starts as an ordinary morning. You're foraging with your group in a grove of ancient fig trees, their massive trunks scarred by countless seasons of growth and survival. The fruits are ripe, hanging heavy and sweet, and for a moment you allow yourself to focus entirely on the simple pleasure of eating something that doesn't taste like dirt or require you to crack it open with a rock. That's your first mistake. In this world, letting your guard down for even 30 seconds can be your last. The attack comes from upwind, which should have been impossible. Machairodus, That nightmare cat we discussed earlier has learned to mask its scent by rolling in mud and rotting vegetation. It's been watching your group for hours, studying your patterns, learning your routines. This isn't just a predator hunting for its next meal. This is a tactician executing a carefully planned assault. The first sign of danger isn't a roar or a growl, it's silence. The forest goes completely quiet, as if every living thing is holding its breath. Your heightened senses, evolved through generations of being hunted, immediately pick up on this wrongness. Your head snaps up from the fig you were eating, sticky juice still dripping from your fingers. Then you see it. 400 pounds of muscle, fang, and predatory intelligence moving through the underbrush with impossible stealth for something its size. The saber teeth catch a shaft of sunlight filtering through the canopy, gleaming like polished bone daggers. But it's the eyes that freeze your blood. These aren't the eyes of a mindless killing machine. There's intelligence there, calculation, and something that looks almost like amusement. Your vocal cords, primitive as they are, manage to produce the warning call that has saved countless lives throughout your species' brief existence. It's a sound that translates roughly to, "Death approaches from the southeast, scatter now, climb high, don't look back." Every member of your group understands this call at a genetic level, and the response is immediate and coordinated. But Machairodus has planned for this too. As your group scatters toward the nearest climbable trees, you realize with growing horror that this cat hasn't come alone. Its mate emerges from concealment on the opposite side of the grove, cutting off the primary escape route. These predators have learned to hunt cooperatively, and they've specifically learned to hunt your kind. What happens next is a masterclass in prehistoric survival that would make modern military strategists weep with admiration. Your group doesn't panic. Panic gets you killed. Instead, they execute a defensive strategy that has been refined through generations of similar encounters. The older members of your group immediately begin making noise, lots of it, while the younger and more agile scramble for the highest branches they can reach. But you're not just running, you're fighting back. And this is where the story gets truly remarkable, because your ancestors didn't just learn to survive these encounters. They learned to win them. The noise-making isn't random. It's a coordinated effort to confuse the cat's hunting instincts, which rely heavily on isolating individual prey. When faced with what sounds like dozens of potential targets all screaming different warnings from different directions, even an apex predator can become overwhelmed. The acoustic chaos disrupts their ability to focus on any single victim. Meanwhile, those who've reached the trees aren't just hiding, they're gathering ammunition, branches, heavy fruits, anything that can be thrown with enough force to cause pain or distraction. Your ancestors have discovered that, while they can't outfight these giants one-on-one, they can make the cost of hunting them prohibitively high. The first volley of projectiles rains down on the male Machairodus as it positions itself beneath the largest fig tree, clearly planning to wait out your group until hunger forces someone to descend. A heavy branch, thrown with surprising accuracy, strikes the cat directly between the shoulder blades. The impact doesn't seriously injure the predator, but it definitely gets its attention. More importantly, it changes the dynamic of the encounter. Suddenly, the cat isn't just hunting passive prey, it's being actively attacked by creatures it had dismissed as helpless. This is a new experience for a predator that's used to victims that either run or freeze in terror. Your ancestors are doing neither. The female cat, perhaps sensing that this hunt is becoming more complicated than anticipated, attempts to climb the tree where most of your group has taken refuge. This is exactly what your people have been hoping for. Cats are excellent climbers, but they're not as agile in the canopy as primates who've been living in trees for millions of years. As the saber-tooth begins its ascent, your group executes a maneuver that would look familiar to anyone who's ever watched a nature documentary about chimpanzees defending their territory. They don't climb higher. They climb laterally, using the interconnected branches of neighboring trees to surround their attacker. What follows is a coordinated assault that transforms your ancestors from prey into a pack of aerial fighters. Sticks rain down from every direction, not randomly, but in a calculated pattern designed to force the climbing cat into increasingly precarious positions. Every time Machaerodus tries to secure its grip on a branch, another projectile forces it to shift its weight, making its position more unstable. But the real genius of this strategy isn't the throwing, it's the coordination. Your group has learned to work together in ways that amplify their individual capabilities exponentially. While some members throw projectiles, others use long branches as spears, jabbing at the cat whenever it comes within range. Still others create noise and movement designed to confuse and disorient. The male cat, growing frustrated with the impossible task of catching prey that refuses to behave like prey, makes a critical error. It roars in anger, a sound so powerful that it can be heard for miles. In the modern world, this would be merely intimidating. In prehistoric Africa, it's essentially ringing the dinner bell for every scavenger in the region. Your ancestors know this. They've learned that patience is often more effective than aggression. So they wait, maintaining their defensive positions, continuing their harassment, but not pressing their attack. They're waiting for reinforcements, and in this ecosystem, reinforcements always come. The first to arrive are the hyenas. Not the relatively small spotted hyenas of today, but Percrocuta gigantea. Those bear-sized scavengers with bone-crushing jaws and an attitude that suggests they take competition personally. They're drawn by the sound of the saber-tooth's roar, which, in their experience, usually means fresh meat is about to become available. The arrival of the hyenas completely changes the tactical situation. Suddenly, the saber-toothed cats find themselves facing not just a group of annoying primates throwing sticks, but genuine competitors for whatever kill they might eventually make. The cost-benefit analysis that governs all predator behavior shifts dramatically. Machaerodus and its mate are forced to make a choice. They can continue trying to extract a meal from your well-defended group, knowing that even if they succeed, they'll have to fight off a pack of giant hyenas for the privilege of eating. Or they can withdraw and look for easier prey that won't require them to wage a multi-front war for their dinner. This time, wisdom prevails over hunger. The cats withdraw, moving off through the forest with the fluid grace that makes them such effective hunters. But they don't go far. They've learned something valuable from this encounter, and they'll use that knowledge to refine their hunting strategies for future attempts. Your group has won this particular battle, but the war is far from over. As you and your companions descend from the trees, checking each other for injuries and sharing the grunts and gestures that pass for congratulations in your primitive society, you're all acutely aware that this was just one engagement in an ongoing conflict that will define your species' future. The hyenas, denied the easy meal they were expecting, circle the grove for several minutes before moving on. But their presence serves as a reminder of how precarious life is in this ecosystem. Everything is connected, every action has consequences, and survival requires not just individual skill, but an understanding of complex ecological relationships. As your group settles back into the routine of foraging, there's a subtle but important change in the atmosphere. The successful defense against the saber-toothed cats has reinforced something crucial about your ancestors' approach to survival. They're not just adapting to their environment, they're beginning to shape it. This shift from passive adaptation to active environmental manipulation represents one of the most significant developments in human evolution. Your ancestors are learning that they don't have to accept their position as prey. With intelligence, cooperation, and strategic thinking, they can challenge even the most formidable predators on something approaching equal terms. But this newfound confidence comes with its own dangers. Success can breed overconfidence, and overconfidence in this environment is usually fatal. The ecosystem your ancestors inhabit is constantly evolving, constantly presenting new challenges. The predators they've learned to fight are also learning, adapting their own strategies in response to these new defensive tactics. The evolutionary arms race between early humans and the megafauna of prehistoric Africa is accelerating, and each engagement teaches both sides valuable lessons about warfare, strategy, and survival. Your ancestors are becoming more sophisticated fighters, but their enemies are becoming more sophisticated hunters. And in the shadows of this ancient forest, something even more dangerous than saber-toothed cats or giant hyenas is beginning to stir. Something that will test every survival strategy your ancestors have developed and force them to evolve not just physically, but culturally and technologically, in ways that will echo through millions of years of human history. The next phase of this prehistoric war is about to begin, and it will determine whether your species has what it takes to inherit the Earth. The forest holds its breath as dawn breaks over prehistoric Africa. But this isn't the peaceful morning you might imagine. Your group has barely recovered from yesterday's encounter with the saber-toothed cats when the ground beneath your feet begins to tremble. Not the subtle vibration of distant thunder, but something rhythmic, deliberate, and getting closer. Something massive is approaching through the forest, and from the sound of it, whatever's coming makes Macaridus look like a house cat with delusions of grandeur. Your enhanced hearing, sharpened by generations of being hunted, picks up the distinctive sound pattern first. Heavy footfalls, but not the padding of a cat or the lumbering gait of a bear. This is something else entirely. Something that moves with purpose and intelligence, crashing through underbrush that would stop smaller creatures in their tracks. The sound echoes off the ancient tree trunks like thunder, but thunder that follows a pattern, a rhythm that speaks of conscious movement rather than natural phenomenon. Then you see it, and your primitive brain struggles to process what your eyes are telling you. Emerging from the forest like something from a fever dream comes Dinotherium, a creature so massive that it defies comprehension. Picture an elephant, then multiply everything by 3. We're talking about an animal that stands 14 feet at the shoulder, weighs as much as 4 modern elephants, and sports tusks that curve downward like enormous ivory sickles designed specifically for destruction. But this isn't just size for the sake of intimidation. Every aspect of Dinotherium's anatomy screams apex predator in a way that makes your species' recent victories over saber-toothed cats seem like playground squabbles. Those downward curving tusks aren't decorative. They're perfectly designed for hooking, lifting, and dismembering anything unfortunate enough to get in this creature's way. The trunk isn't just for grabbing vegetation. It's a muscular appendage capable of crushing bones or flinging your entire group around like ragdolls. Your group's response to this new threat reveals just how much your species has learned about survival in the past few generations. There's no panicked scattering this time, no desperate scramble for the nearest trees. Instead, your people execute a tactical withdrawal that would impress modern military strategists. They move as a unit, maintaining communication through their primitive but effective system of grunts and gestures, constantly assessing the threat while positioning themselves for maximum survival advantage. The intelligence behind this coordinated response represents something revolutionary in the natural world. Your ancestors aren't just reacting to threats anymore. They're analyzing them, categorizing them, and developing specific countermeasures based on the type of danger they're facing. The strategy for dealing with a stalking cat is completely different from the approach needed to survive an encounter with a massive herbivore that could accidentally crush you while scratching an itch. Dinotherium, however, isn't behaving like a typical herbivore. As it crashes through the forest, destroying centuries-old trees with casual swipes of its tusks, it becomes clear that this creature is hunting. Not for vegetation, but for something specific. Its massive head swings back and forth, testing the air with its trunk, following a scent trail that leads directly toward your group's location. This is when you realize that the rules of survival your species has been developing are about to be tested against something entirely new. All your strategies have been built around predators that follow predictable patterns, cats that stalk and ambush, bears that charge and overwhelm, hyenas that harass and wear down their prey. But Dinotherium doesn't fit any of these categories. It's creating its own category, and your ancestors are about to become the first early humans to figure out how to survive it. The first indication that this encounter will be different comes when your group reaches what should have been safety. The grove of ancient trees that provided perfect defensive positions against the saber-toothed cats suddenly looks pathetically inadequate when faced with a creature that treats full-grown trees like annoying weeds. Dinotherium approaches the largest tree in the grove and, with a casual swing of its massive head, tears it completely out of the ground, roots and all. Your people watch in stunned silence as their primary defensive strategy crumbles along with the grove's canopy. The trees that have been their highways, their fortresses, and their last line of defense against ground-based predators are suddenly revealed to be no more substantial than matchsticks in the face of this prehistoric juggernaut. But here's where the story takes a turn that reveals the true genius of early human survival strategies. Instead of despair or panic, your group's reaction is immediate adaptation. If the old defensive strategies won't work against this new threat, then new strategies must be developed, and they must be developed right now, with a 14-foot-tall death machine bearing down on them. The innovation that follows happens so quickly that it seems almost supernatural, but it's actually the result of millions of years of evolutionary pressure condensed into a few terrifying minutes. Your ancestors don't just scatter randomly, they scatter strategically, but not to escape. They're positioning themselves to implement a completely new form of warfare that has never been attempted by any species in Earth's history. What they do next is form the world's first coordinated, multi-directional assault by a species against a creature exponentially more powerful than themselves. While some members of your group create diversions at the front of the beast, others position themselves at its flanks and rear. This isn't just about survival anymore. This is about turning the tables on a creature that considers your entire species to be insignificant nuisances. The attack begins with psychological warfare. Your people have learned that even the most powerful predators can be confused and disoriented by unexpected stimuli. They begin making sounds unlike anything in the natural world. A cacophony of shrieks, roars, and rhythmic chanting that seems designed to convince Dinotherium that it's facing not a small group of primates, but some kind of supernatural threat. The effect is immediate and dramatic. The massive creature, which had been advancing with the confidence of something that has never encountered serious resistance, suddenly stops. Its trunk waves uncertainly in the air, trying to identify the source of these alien sounds. For the first time since it emerged from the forest, Dinotherium looks uncertain. Your ancestors press their advantage. They've discovered something that will eventually become one of humanity's most powerful weapons: the ability to create fear in creatures much more physically powerful than themselves. The psychological assault intensifies, with different members of your group producing different sounds from different locations, creating an acoustic environment so chaotic and threatening that even a creature the size of Dinotherium begins to question whether this fight is worth the effort. But psychological warfare alone won't win this battle. Your ancestors know that fear is temporary, and once it wears off, they'll be facing a very angry creature with the power to flatten their entire grove. So, they escalate to the next phase of their improvised battle plan. Physical harassment designed not to cause serious damage, but to make the cost of continuing this encounter prohibitively high. The projectile assault that follows is unlike anything seen in the previous fight with the saber-toothed cats. Your people have learned to work together in ways that amplify their individual capabilities exponentially. Instead of random throwing, they coordinate their attacks to create a constant barrage from multiple directions. Heavy fruits, sharp sticks, and chunks of broken stone rain down on Dinotherium from angles it can't simultaneously defend against. More importantly, They've learned to target the creature's vulnerabilities, the eyes, the sensitive trunk, the joints where thick hide gives way to more tender flesh. Your ancestors are conducting a systematic campaign designed to convince this prehistoric giant that hunting them will result in serious injury, even if it ultimately succeeds. Dinotherium's response reveals just how unprecedented this situation is. The creature has clearly never faced organized resistance from prey before. Its reactions become increasingly erratic as it tries to defend against attacks coming from every direction. It swings its massive tusks at targets that dart away just before the blow lands. It trumpets in frustration as projectiles strike sensitive areas just beyond its ability to retaliate effectively. But the most remarkable aspect of this battle isn't the tactics your ancestors are using. It's the fact that they're learning and adapting in real time, making strategic adjustments based on the creature's responses. When Dinotherium focuses on attackers to its left, your people shift their assault to the right. When it tries to use its trunk to grab tormentors directly in front of it, they attack from behind and above. This is warfare in its purest form, and your ancestors are inventing it as they go. They're discovering principles of military strategy that won't be formally articulated for millions of years. The importance of mobility over static defense, the power of coordinated attacks against single targets, the psychological impact of making an enemy feel surrounded and outnumbered. The battle reaches its climax when Dinotherium, frustrated beyond endurance, makes the mistake that will define the outcome of this encounter. It charges directly at the largest concentration of attackers, using its massive size and power in exactly the way your ancestors have been hoping it would. Because they've learned something crucial about physics that the giant hasn't. Momentum works both ways. As the creature thunders forward, your people execute a maneuver that requires split-second timing and absolute trust in each other's abilities. Instead of scattering, they funnel the charging beast directly toward a carefully chosen section of terrain, where the forest floor drops away into a steep ravine hidden by thick undergrowth. Dinotherium, moving at full speed and focused entirely on crushing the annoying primates that have been tormenting it, doesn't see the trap until it's too late. The massive creature crashes through the concealing vegetation and plunges into the ravine with a sound like a landslide. The impact echoes through the forest for miles, and when the dust settles, your ancestors peer down at their defeated enemy with something approaching amazement. They've just accomplished something that should have been impossible. A small group of early humans, using nothing but intelligence, coordination, and strategic thinking, have defeated a creature that outweighed them by several thousand pounds. This isn't just survival anymore. This is dominance. But victory comes with its own complications. The sound of Dinotherium's fall has attracted every scavenger in the region, and your ancestors suddenly find themselves in possession of the largest food source any of them have ever seen. The question now becomes whether they can defend their prize against the horde of competitors that are undoubtedly racing toward the sound of opportunity. The next few hours will test everything your species has learned about cooperation, strategy, and the delicate balance between aggression and survival. Because in this prehistoric world, winning one battle often means you've just earned the right to fight 10 more. The aftermath of your victory over Dinotherium creates problems your ancestors never anticipated. Success, it turns out, is almost as dangerous as failure in this prehistoric nightmare. The massive carcass lying at the bottom of the ravine represents more meat than your small group could consume in months. But it also broadcasts a dinner invitation to every predator and scavenger within a 20-mile radius. The first arrivals are the flies, clouds of them, descending on the fallen giant like a living black storm. But flies are the least of your concerns. Within minutes, you can hear them coming through the forest. The excited yipping of hyena packs, the heavy breathing of cave bears drawn by the scent of fresh death, and somewhere in the distance, the distinctive roar of saber-toothed cats, who've decided that whatever killed something this massive is either worth investigating or worth eliminating, your group faces a decision that will echo through evolutionary history. Do you abandon this incredible windfall and retreat to safety? Or do you stand your ground and defend what you've earned? The choice your ancestors make will determine whether early humans remain opportunistic scavengers or evolve into something far more dangerous. The decision comes naturally, almost instinctively. Your people have just proven they can bring down giants. They're not about to be intimidated by anything smaller. But defending a kill site against multiple threats requires a completely different set of strategies than hunting a single massive prey animal. Your ancestors are about to invent the concept of siege warfare, and they're going to do it with nothing but sticks, stones, and an unshakable belief in their own ingenuity. The first wave of attackers arrives before you've even finished celebrating your victory. A pack of Percrocuta gigantea, those bear-sized hyenas we discussed earlier, emerges from the undergrowth with the confident swagger of creatures who've never been successfully challenged for a carcass. Their powerful jaws are already working in anticipation, grinding together with a sound like millstones crushing grain. But these hyenas are about to receive an education in the new rules of survival that your ancestors are writing in real time. Instead of the usual pattern of intimidation followed by grudging retreat, your people respond with immediate and overwhelming aggression. Not because they've become bloodthirsty, but because they've learned something crucial about pack dynamics. The first challenge you win decisively is often the last challenge you have to fight. The assault begins before the hyenas have even reached the ravine. Your ancestors have positioned themselves in elevated positions around the kill site, turning the terrain into a natural amphitheater, with themselves as the dominant force. As the hyenas approach, they're met with a coordinated barrage that makes their previous encounter with Dinotherium look like a warm-up exercise. But this isn't just random violence. Your people have developed something approaching military tactics. They target the pack leader first, recognizing that hyena social structure depends on clear hierarchy. Heavy stones and sharpened sticks focus on the largest, most confident individual, while smaller projectiles harass and confuse the subordinate members. The pack leader, struck repeatedly by missiles that seem to come from everywhere at once, makes the mistake of trying to charge up the ravine wall toward the source of the attack. This plays directly into your ancestors' hands, because they've learned something important about physics that the hyena hasn't. Objects falling from height carry exponentially more force than objects thrown horizontally. A boulder, carefully positioned and held in place by several members of your group, is released at precisely the moment when the climbing hyena reaches the optimal target zone. The impact is devastating, and the message it sends to the rest of the pack is unmistakable. This kill site is defended by creatures willing and able to use lethal force to protect what they've claimed. The surviving hyenas retreat, but not far. They take positions around the perimeter of the ravine, clearly planning to wait for your group to exhaust themselves or abandon their prize. It's a strategy that has probably worked countless times before against other scavengers, but your ancestors aren't other scavengers, and they're about to demonstrate why patience can be a double-edged weapon. Instead of wearing themselves out with continuous defensive actions, your people settle into a sustainable rotation system that allows them to maintain vigilance while conserving energy. Some members keep watch while others rest. Some gather additional ammunition, while others tend to minor injuries from the day's battles. Most importantly, they begin the process of actually harvesting meat from their kill, working quickly but efficiently to extract maximum value before decomposition makes the carcass worthless. This systematic approach to resource extraction represents another evolutionary leap forward. Your ancestors aren't just successful hunters now. They're becoming logistical experts, learning to maximize the return on their dangerous investments. They're developing the planning skills that will eventually allow humans to undertake massive cooperative projects, from building cities to launching spacecraft.
Hey,
But the hyenas aren't the only threat your ancestors need to worry about. As afternoon fades toward evening, larger and more dangerous competitors begin to arrive. A family group of cave bears, drawn by the scent of death and the sounds of conflict, emerges from the forest with the casual confidence of creatures who've never met anything they couldn't intimidate or overpower. Cave bears in this era aren't the relatively modest creatures that would eventually populate European caves. These are Agriotherium africanum, massive predators that combine the size of modern grizzlies with the aggression of creatures that have never learned to fear anything. Their arrival changes the entire dynamic of the situation, because unlike the hyenas, these bears aren't interested in waiting for your group to abandon the kill site. They're planning to take it by force. The bear family's approach is methodical and terrifying. They don't rush forward in a disorganized charge. Instead, they spread out, using natural cover to advance from multiple directions simultaneously. These creatures have clearly done this before, and they've developed their own tactical approach to displacing competitors from valuable resources. Your ancestors watched this flanking maneuver develop with growing alarm. All their previous victories have been against single large threats or disorganized groups. This is the first time they've faced coordinated opposition from creatures with their own strategic capabilities. The bears aren't just bigger and stronger than anything your people have fought before. They're also smarter, and that combination represents an existential threat to everything your species has achieved. But your ancestors have one crucial advantage that they're only beginning to understand: the power of rapid innovation under pressure. While the bears execute their carefully planned approach, your people are inventing countermeasures that have never been attempted in the history of life on Earth. The solution they develop is elegant in its simplicity and revolutionary in its implications. Instead of trying to defend fixed positions against a superior force, they abandon the concept of static defense entirely. They turn the entire kill site into a mobile battlefield where their superior agility and coordination can offset the bears' advantages in size and strength. The battle that follows is unlike anything that has ever occurred in the natural world. Your ancestors don't just fight the bears, they choreograph the entire encounter, using the terrain, the weather, and even the competing scavengers as weapons in their arsenal. When the lead bear charges toward what appears to be a concentrated group of defenders, it discovers too late that it's been lured into a carefully prepared killing zone where the ravine's walls funnel its attack into a narrow corridor lined with your people's most experienced fighters. The psychological impact of this tactical sophistication is perhaps even more important than its immediate military effectiveness. The bears, accustomed to overwhelming opposition through brute force, find themselves facing enemies who seem to anticipate their every move. This creates a level of uncertainty and stress that these apex predators have never experienced before. As the largest bear attempts to climb out of the ravine after being pelted with a coordinated stone barrage, it makes a critical discovery. Your ancestors have prepared for this contingency too. The ravine walls have been systematically weakened at key points, and the bear's own weight triggers a controlled collapse that traps it in exactly the position your people want it. What happens next represents the moment when early humans transition from successful survivors to apex predators. The trapped bear, despite its massive size and strength, becomes the target of a sustained assault that demonstrates just how far your species has evolved from the frightened primates who once hid in trees from passing predators. The attack is methodical, coordinated, and absolutely relentless. Your ancestors have learned to work together in ways that multiply their individual capabilities exponentially. They don't just throw random projectiles at their trapped enemy. They coordinate their attacks to create maximum psychological impact while minimizing their own risk. Some members of your group focus on keeping the bear disoriented with constant noise and movement, while others deliver precisely targeted strikes to vulnerable areas. The creature's eyes, ears, and sensitive nose become primary targets, not necessarily to cause fatal damage, but to reduce its ability to mount effective counterattacks. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this assault is its restraint. Your ancestors have learned something that many apex predators never master: when to stop fighting. They don't continue their attack until the bear is dead. Instead, they maintain pressure until it becomes clear that their opponent has lost the will to continue. Then, they allow it to retreat with enough dignity intact to prevent future revenge attacks. This sophisticated understanding of conflict resolution represents another evolutionary leap forward. Your ancestors are learning that sometimes the most effective way to win a war is to give your enemies a face-saving way to lose. The bear family withdraws from the kill site, but they do so in a way that doesn't require them to view your people as permanent enemies. By evening, word of your group's success has spread throughout the forest ecosystem in ways that transcend simple animal communication. Every predator and scavenger in the region now knows that something has changed in the balance of power. The small bipedal primates who were once easy prey have become something entirely new, something that fights back with intelligence and coordination that makes them far more dangerous than their size would suggest. But victory brings responsibility, and your ancestors are about to discover that becoming apex predators means accepting all the challenges that come with that status. Other human groups in the region are beginning to take notice of your people's success, and not all of them are interested in peaceful coexistence. The age of human warfare is about to begin, and it will be fought not just against the giants of the prehistoric world, but against other members of your own species who have their own ideas about how to survive in this dangerous environment. The skills your ancestors have developed in fighting megafauna are about to be tested against the most dangerous predator of all, themselves. The real war for the future of humanity is just beginning, and the outcome will determine whether your species learns to cooperate on a scale large enough to dominate the planet, or fragments into competing groups that tear each other apart in their struggle for survival. The giants may have been defeated, but the greatest challenges still lie ahead. The smoke from your group's cooking fires rises into the prehistoric night, carrying with it the scent of roasted Dinotherium meat and something else entirely: news. In this ancient world, information travels on the wind, in the patterns of bird flight, in the subtle changes to animal behavior that your heightened senses have learned to read like a primitive newspaper. And tonight, that information is telling a story your ancestors hoped they'd never have to face. Other human groups have caught the scent of your success, and they're coming, not to celebrate your victory over the giants, not to learn from your innovations, but to take what you've earned through blood and ingenuity. Because in this world, where resources are scarce and survival is never guaranteed, your triumph has made you a target for the most dangerous predator your species will ever face: yourselves. The first sign of trouble comes from the monkeys, not the chattering, playful creatures you might imagine, but the sophisticated early warning system that your ancestors have learned to read like a military intelligence network. When the calls of the vervets shift from their normal territorial disputes to the sharp staccato warnings that mean strangers approaching with weapons, every member of your group immediately understands what's happening. This is the moment when everything your people have learned about fighting giants becomes preparation for something far more complex and terrifying. Because while Dinotherium was massive and powerful, it was ultimately predictable. It followed the instinctive patterns of a creature that had evolved for millions of years to behave in certain ways. But humans, even early humans, are different. They think, they plan, they adapt, and most dangerous of all, they learn from watching others succeed. The approaching group isn't stumbling blindly through the forest like most predators would. They're moving with purpose, using the same stealth techniques your people have developed, staying downwind, timing their approach to coincide with the natural sound patterns of the nocturnal forest. These aren't random scavengers hoping to steal scraps from your kill. These are competitors who've been watching your tactics, studying your methods, and developing countermeasures specifically designed to defeat you. Your ancestors' response to this new threat reveals just how far they've evolved beyond simple survival instincts. There's no panic, no desperate scramble to defend fixed positions. Instead, your group immediately begins implementing strategies that won't be formally recognized by military theorists for millions of years. They're about to conduct the world's first intelligence gathering operation, and they're going to do it with nothing but enhanced senses and the kind of intuitive cooperation that comes from generations of fighting together against impossible odds. The scouting mission that follows is a masterpiece of prehistoric reconnaissance. Your most experienced trackers slip away from the kill site using movement techniques that make them nearly invisible even to other humans. They don't just locate the approaching threat. They analyze it, counting numbers, assessing weapons, identifying leaders, and most importantly, trying to understand the enemy's tactical approach. What they discover is both reassuring and terrifying. The approaching group is smaller than yours, but they're better armed. While your people have been focusing on coordination and tactical innovation, these competitors have been developing weapons technology. They carry spears with fire-hardened points, clubs embedded with sharp stones. And most alarming of all, they move with the disciplined coordination of a group that's done this before. This isn't their first raid on a successful hunting party. They've clearly developed a systematic approach to taking resources from other human groups, and they've had enough success to become confident in their methods. Your ancestors are about to face enemies who understand their capabilities and have prepared specific counters for every advantage your people think they possess. The intelligence your scouts bring back forces your group to confront a reality that will define human civilization for the rest of its existence. Violence between members of your own species requires completely different strategies than violence against other animals. When you fight a saber-toothed cat, you can predict its behavior based on millions of years of evolutionary programming. When you fight other humans, you're facing opponents who can think, plan, and adapt just as quickly as you can. Your ancestors' response to this challenge reveals the moment when tactical thinking evolves into strategic planning. They don't just prepare to defend their kill site. They begin developing a comprehensive approach to the problem of human versus human conflict that addresses not just the immediate threat, but the long-term implications of whatever happens next. The plan they develop is elegant in its sophistication and brutal in its practicality. Instead of waiting to be attacked, they decide to control the terms of engagement. Using their superior knowledge of the local terrain, they begin preparing the battlefield to maximize their advantages while minimizing the enemy's strengths. The kill site itself becomes a carefully constructed trap. Your people don't abandon their prize, but they also don't cluster around it like typical defenders. Instead, they create the appearance of a normal defensive posture while actually positioning themselves to execute a complex ambush that will catch the raiders completely off guard. But the real genius of their plan isn't military. It's psychological. Your ancestors have realized something that modern conflict theorists spend years studying. The most effective way to win a war is to convince your enemies that fighting you will cost them more than they can afford to lose. They're about to conduct a demonstration of capability that will reshape the balance of power between human groups throughout the region. The raiders approach just before dawn, using the pre-dawn darkness that typically provides the best cover for surprise attacks. They move with practiced stealth, clearly following a plan they've used successfully before. Their formation is sophisticated, with advanced scouts, flanking elements, and what appears to be a reserve force positioned to exploit whatever breakthrough their main assault achieves. But as they close in on what they believe is a group of successful but naive hunters clustered around their prize, they're actually walking into a trap that demonstrates just how far your ancestors have evolved beyond simple survival thinking. Every aspect of the raiders' approach has been anticipated, analyzed, and prepared for. The battle begins, not with the clash of weapons, but with a coordinated psychological assault that strikes at the very foundation of the raiders' confidence. As they move into position for their planned attack, they're suddenly surrounded by sounds that shouldn't exist. human voices, but distorted and amplified by carefully positioned acoustic channels that make your small group sound like a massive tribe. The effect is immediate and devastating. The raiders, who were expecting to face a handful of disorganized defenders, suddenly find themselves apparently surrounded by an enemy force of unknown size, making sounds they've never heard before. Their careful tactical formation begins to break down as individual members try to identify threats that seem to be coming from everywhere at once. Your ancestors press their psychological advantage by introducing visual elements that compound the raiders' confusion. Fires suddenly flare up in positions throughout the forest, creating the impression of a vast encampment rather than a single kill site. Shadows move between the trees, in patterns that suggest coordinated movement by dozens of individuals rather than the actual dozen members of your group. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this psychological warfare is its restraint. Your people aren't trying to terrorize their enemies into mindless panic. Instead, they're creating a level of uncertainty that forces the raiders to question every assumption they've made about this encounter. The message being sent is clear. You think you know what you're dealing with, but you're wrong, and the price of continuing this attack may be higher than you're prepared to pay. The raiders' response reveals something crucial about early human psychology that will echo through millions of years of warfare. When faced with uncertainty about enemy capabilities, even the most aggressive groups tend to pause and reassess rather than charge blindly forward. The raiders don't retreat, but they also don't press their attack. Instead, they try to gather more information, and that hesitation gives your ancestors exactly the opening they've been hoping for. What happens next represents the birth of tactical deception as a military art form. Your people don't launch a direct counterattack against the confused raiders. Instead, they execute a maneuver that turns the raiders' own tactical thinking against them. While the enemy tries to understand what they're facing, your ancestors systematically eliminate their advantages through a series of precisely coordinated actions. The raiders' advanced scouts, isolated from their main force by the acoustic confusion your people have created, find themselves facing what appears to be overwhelming local superiority. They're not killed or captured, but they're systematically harassed and disoriented until they lose track of their own position relative to their comrades. Meanwhile, the main raiding force discovers that the terrain they've been counting on for their attack has been subtly modified. Carefully placed obstacles funnel their movement into channels where your people can engage them on favorable terms. Loose stones positioned on slopes can be triggered to create avalanches that block retreat routes. Concealed pits make rapid movement dangerous and coordination difficult. But the most sophisticated aspect of your ancestors' defensive strategy is its flexibility. Unlike their previous battles against predictable animal opponents, this engagement requires constant adaptation as the raiders adjust their tactics in real time. Your people respond by implementing what military theorists would eventually call fluid defense, constantly shifting their positions and approaches to maintain advantage over enemies who are actively trying to counter their moves. The turning point comes when the raiders attempt to execute their own coordinated assault, only to discover that your ancestors have been preparing for exactly this moment. The attack that was supposed to overwhelm your group's defenses instead triggers a carefully orchestrated response that turns the raiders from hunters into hunted. Your people don't just fight back. They demonstrate capabilities that convince the raiders they've made a fundamental miscalculation about the nature of their targets. The coordination, the tactical sophistication, the sheer level of preparation revealed by your group's response sends a message that transcends the immediate battle. These aren't just successful hunters who got lucky against some giants. These are people who've evolved into something entirely new, something far more dangerous than their size and numbers would suggest. The raiders' retreat isn't a panicked flight, but it is decisive. They withdraw not because they've been defeated in direct combat, but because they've been convinced that the cost of victory would exceed any possible benefit. Your ancestors have achieved to fight it to completion. But something remarkable, they've won a war without having victory in this engagement, creates new challenges that your people are only beginning to understand. Word of their success will spread throughout the region, carried by the retreating raiders and observed by the countless other species that monitor human conflicts for their own survival purposes. Your group has established itself as a dominant force in the local ecosystem, but dominance comes with responsibilities and threats that successful scavengers never have to face. Other human groups will now have to decide whether to approach your people as potential allies, dangerous enemies, or sources of knowledge about advanced survival techniques. The balance of power in the region has shifted, and your ancestors are about to discover that being successful enough to intimidate your neighbors is both the greatest achievement and the greatest burden any prehistoric society can acquire. The age of human civilization is beginning, forged not in the peaceful cooperation of myth, but in the brutal crucible of competition between groups intelligent enough to make war into an art form. Your ancestors have survived the giants of the prehistoric world, but now they face a challenge that will define the next 5 million years of human development: learning to live with the consequences of their own success. The real test of your species' future is about to begin, and it will determine whether humans learn to cooperate on a scale large enough to build civilizations, or fragment into competing tribes that spend their intelligence and courage destroying each other instead of conquering the world. The choice your ancestors make in the coming days will echo through every page of human history that follows. The victory over the raiders should have brought peace. But in this ancient world, success only breeds new challenges. As your group settles back into the routine of processing their massive kill, they're unaware that their triumph has set in motion events that will test every survival skill they've developed. Because scattered throughout the forest are other human groups, each watching, each learning, and each making their own calculations about what your people's success means for their own survival. The first delegation arrives 3 days after the raiders' retreat. But these aren't enemies approaching with weapons drawn. These are emissaries, members of a neighboring group who've witnessed your ancestors' victories and drawn very different conclusions about how to respond. They approach openly, using the primitive but effective diplomatic signals that early human societies had developed to distinguish peaceful contact from hostile intent. Your people's response to this diplomatic overture reveals another evolutionary leap in human social development. Instead of treating all strangers as threats, they've learned to recognize the difference between raiders seeking to steal resources and potential allies seeking to share knowledge. This ability to distinguish between different types of human contact represents the beginning of politics, diplomacy, and all the complex social structures that will eventually allow humans to build civilizations. The meeting that follows takes place on neutral ground, away from the kill site but close enough that both groups can maintain security. What unfolds is humanity's first international summit, conducted entirely through gestures, expressions, and the few dozen proto-words that different human groups have begun to share across tribal boundaries. The visiting delegation's leader, an older female whose scars tell stories of countless survival battles, approaches your group's most experienced hunter with something approaching reverence. She's clearly heard detailed accounts of your victories over both the giants and the raiders, and she's come to propose something unprecedented in early human society: a formal alliance between groups. The negotiations that follow are conducted in a language of survival that transcends specific words or cultural differences. Through careful demonstration and patient repetition, the visiting group explains that they control territory rich in a resource your people desperately need: high-quality stone for tool making. In return for access to your group's advanced hunting and defensive techniques, they're offering to share the locations of their best quarry sites. Your ancestors' response to this proposal demonstrates just how far human thinking has evolved beyond simple survival calculations. They don't just consider the immediate benefits of better stone tools. They begin thinking strategically about the long-term implications of formal cooperation between human groups. They're inventing the concept of international relations, and they're doing it with the same innovative thinking that allowed them to defeat creatures 10 times their size. The alliance agreement they eventually reach is simple in its terms, but revolutionary in its implications. The two groups will share certain resources and technologies, while maintaining separate territories and leadership structures. Most importantly, they agree to coordinate their defensive efforts against common threats, creating the first military alliance in human history. But as news of this alliance spreads through the regional network of human settlements, it triggers responses that your ancestors didn't anticipate. Other groups begin forming their own alliances, not necessarily to cooperate with your people, but to balance the new concentration of power you've created. The prehistoric equivalent of an arms race begins, with different human communities competing to develop the most effective combinations of weapons, tactics, and cooperative strategies. Within weeks, the entire regional balance of power has shifted from individual groups competing for resources to networks of allied communities engaged in increasingly sophisticated forms of competition. Your ancestors have accidentally invented geopolitics, and they're about to discover that success in this new arena requires skills that go far beyond hunting giants or winning battles. The first test of their new diplomatic order comes when a coalition of 3 smaller groups approaches the boundary between your territory and that of your new allies. These aren't raiders seeking to steal resources through direct violence. They're negotiators, representatives of communities that want to establish their own relationships with the powerful alliance you've created. The challenge your ancestors face is unlike anything they've encountered before. Military threats can be met with coordinated violence. Resource competition can be resolved through superior hunting or gathering techniques. But diplomatic challenges require a completely different set of skills. The ability to understand other groups' motivations, to predict the long-term consequences of different agreements, and to balance immediate needs against future stability. Your people's approach to this diplomatic crisis reveals the moment when human intelligence evolves from tactical thinking to strategic planning on a societal scale. Instead of making quick decisions based on immediate advantages, they begin conducting what amounts to policy analysis, carefully considering how different responses might affect not just their own group, but the entire network of relationships they're now part of. The solution they develop is elegant in its complexity and far-sighted in its implications. Rather than simply accepting or rejecting the coalition's overtures, they propose a new form of relationship that has never existed in human society. A trade network that allows multiple groups to benefit from each other's specialized skills without requiring formal military alliances. Under this arrangement, your group would share hunting techniques with communities that provide access to specific resources. Your allies would offer stoneworking knowledge to groups that control territories rich in medicinal plants. The coalition representatives would coordinate information sharing about predator movements and seasonal resource availability across a much larger geographical area than any single group could monitor effectively. This prehistoric trade network represents another revolutionary development in human social evolution. Your ancestors are learning that competition doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, where one group's success requires another's failure. They're discovering that cooperation can create benefits for everyone involved, and that these benefits can be large enough to change the fundamental nature of human society. But implementing this new social order requires solving problems that your ancestors have never faced before. How do you ensure that different groups honor their agreements when there's no higher authority to enforce contracts? How do you handle disputes between allied communities without destroying the entire network? How do you prevent successful cooperation from creating new inequalities that destabilize the system you're trying to build? The solutions your people develop to these challenges represent the birth of law, government, and social institutions. They create informal but binding procedures for resolving conflicts between groups. They establish protocols for sharing information and coordinating responses to common threats. Most importantly, they develop mechanisms for ensuring that the benefits of cooperation are distributed fairly enough to maintain everyone's commitment to the system. The success of this early experiment in international cooperation has effects that ripple far beyond the immediate participants. Other regions begin developing their own trade networks and alliance systems, each one building on innovations pioneered by your ancestors, but adapted to local conditions and cultural preferences. The concept of human civilization is beginning to take shape, not as a single unified development, but as a network of interconnected experiments in cooperative living. Within a generation, the landscape of human society in prehistoric Africa has been completely transformed. Where once scattered groups competed desperately for scarce resources, networks of allied communities now coordinate their activities to maximize everyone's survival chances. The techniques your ancestors developed for fighting giants have evolved into sophisticated systems for managing complex social relationships. But this new social order creates its own challenges and dangers. As human societies become more complex and interconnected, they also become more vulnerable to systemic failures that can affect multiple groups simultaneously. A drought that might have threatened only one community in the old system can now disrupt entire networks of interdependent relationships. More dangerous still, the same intelligence and cooperation that allows humans to build these sophisticated social systems also makes them more effective at warfare when diplomatic solutions fail. The techniques your ancestors developed for coordinating attacks against megafauna are being refined and expanded into military technologies that make human versus human conflict far more destructive than anything the world has seen before. The first major test of this new reality comes when environmental changes begin to stress the entire regional system. Climate shifts that your individual group might have weathered through temporary migration now threaten to destabilize the entire network of relationships that multiple communities depend on for survival. The response to this crisis reveals both the strengths and weaknesses of the new social order your ancestors have created. The same coordination mechanisms that make cooperative hunting and resource sharing possible also enable rapid communication about environmental threats and coordinated responses to changing conditions. But they also create dependencies that make it impossible for individual groups to adapt quickly to local changes without considering the effects on their allies and trading partners. What follows is humanity's first experiment in large-scale social planning, as networks of allied communities attempt to coordinate their responses to environmental challenges that affect everyone simultaneously. Some groups propose mass migrations to regions with more stable resources. Others advocate for developing new technologies that might allow existing territories to support larger populations despite changing conditions. The debates that rage through these prehistoric communities touch on questions that will occupy human societies for the rest of their existence. How much individual freedom should be sacrificed for collective security? What obligations do successful groups have to assist struggling allies? How should resources be allocated when everyone's survival is at stake, but not everyone has contributed equally to the common effort? Your ancestors' responses to these challenges establish precedents that will influence human social development for millions of years. They're learning that building civilizations requires not just the ability to cooperate against external threats, but the wisdom to manage the internal tensions that cooperation inevitably creates. The solutions they develop aren't perfect, and many of their early experiments in large-scale social organization fail catastrophically. But each failure teaches lessons that inform the next attempt, and gradually, through trial and error paid for in individual lives and community suffering, they begin to develop stable forms of social organization that can survive both external pressures and internal conflicts. As we approach the end of this incredible story of survival and evolution, your ancestors find themselves facing a future that would have been unimaginable when they first opened their eyes in that prehistoric forest. They've evolved from frightened prey, hiding in trees, to become the dominant species in their ecosystem. They've learned to fight giants, defeat organized enemies, and build cooperative societies that amplify their individual capabilities exponentially. But perhaps most remarkably, they've retained the essential characteristics that made their survival possible in the first place. The ability to adapt quickly to new challenges, the willingness to cooperate with others for mutual benefit, and the stubborn refusal to accept that any problem is unsolvable if approached with sufficient intelligence and determination. The world they're creating through their innovations and struggles will eventually become the foundation for everything humans achieve in the millions of years that follow. Every city, every technology, every work of art, every scientific discovery, every act of compassion or courage can trace its origins back to these moments when early humans first learned that they could change their environment instead of simply adapting to it. The giants they fought are long extinct, killed off by environmental changes and the competitive pressure of increasingly sophisticated human societies. But the lessons learned in those battles, the skills developed through those struggles, and the social innovations forged in the crucible of survival against impossible odds continue to shape human civilization to this day. Your ancestors' story is ultimately our story, a reminder that every challenge we face as individuals and societies has been faced before by people with fewer resources, less knowledge, and far more dangerous environments than anything we're likely to encounter. They survived and thrived not because they were stronger or more ruthless than their competitors, but because they learned to work together in ways that made the whole greater than the sum of its parts. The war against the giants ended with humanity's victory, but it was just the beginning of an even greater adventure. The long, difficult, often frustrating, but ultimately triumphant process of learning to build a world worthy of the courage and ingenuity that made survival possible in the first place. The morning sun filters through the canopy of your transformed world. But this isn't the same forest where your ancestors once cowered from saber-toothed predators. The landscape itself has become a testament to human ingenuity, scarred and shaped by generations of increasingly sophisticated survival strategies. Where once massive trees provided the only refuge from ground-dwelling hunters, now carefully maintained clearings serve as meeting grounds for the complex network of alliances your people have built. But success, as your ancestors are learning, creates its own predators. And the most dangerous threat they now face isn't some massive creature with fangs and claws. It's something far more insidious. Something that strikes at the very foundation of everything they've built. Environmental collapse on a scale that makes individual droughts or harsh winters look like minor inconveniences. The first signs are subtle, the kind of changes that individual groups might have adapted to through simple migration or dietary adjustments. But your ancestors are no longer individual groups. They're part of an interconnected web of relationships that spans hundreds of square miles, involving dozens of communities, thousands of individuals, and resource commitments that can't be abandoned without triggering cascading failures throughout the entire system. The rivers that have sustained your trade networks for generations are dropping to levels that make water transport impossible. The seasonal migration routes that different communities have planned their entire yearly cycles around are being disrupted by shifting weather patterns that no one fully understands. Most critically, the large game animals that form the protein foundation of your alliance system are beginning to disappear, not killed off by human hunting, but driven away by environmental changes that affect vast geographical regions simultaneously. Your ancestors face a choice that will define the next phase of human evolution. They can abandon the complex social systems they've built and return to the small group survival strategies that sustain their species for millions of years. Or they can double down on cooperation and innovation, betting everything on their ability to develop solutions to problems that individual communities could never solve alone. The decision, when it comes, isn't made through formal councils or diplomatic negotiations. It emerges organically from thousands of small choices made by individuals and communities throughout the network. A group that specializes in toolmaking decides to share their most advanced techniques with allied communities facing resource shortages. Hunters begin coordinating their efforts across tribal boundaries to track the movements of migrating herds. Most significantly, your ancestors begin experimenting with deliberate environmental modification on a scale that would have been unthinkable just generations earlier. They're learning to think like ecosystem engineers, not just adapting to their environment, but actively reshaping it to better support the complex societies they've built. Controlled burns to encourage the growth of plants that attract game animals. Systematic cultivation of fruit trees in locations that provide resources for multiple allied communities. Most remarkably, they begin developing techniques for water management that allow them to maintain reliable access to this critical resource, even during seasonal droughts. These innovations require levels of cooperation and forward planning that push human social organization to entirely new levels of complexity. Different communities must coordinate their environmental modification efforts to avoid conflicts and maximize benefits. Resources must be allocated, not just for immediate survival needs, but for long-term projects that might not show results for years. Most challenging of all, they must develop ways to ensure that the costs and benefits of these massive undertakings are shared fairly across groups with different capabilities and needs. The social institutions that emerge from these challenges represent humanity's first experiments with formal government, law, and public administration. Your ancestors create mechanisms for making collective decisions that affect multiple communities. They develop systems for resolving disputes that arise when environmental modification efforts benefit some groups more than others. They establish protocols for sharing the knowledge and techniques that these large-scale projects require. But perhaps most importantly, they learn to think beyond the immediate survival horizon that has governed human behavior since the species first emerged. They begin making decisions based not just on what will keep their communities alive through the next season, but on what will create sustainable prosperity for their children and grandchildren. This shift from survival thinking to generational planning represents another evolutionary leap that will define human civilization for the rest of its existence. Your ancestors are learning to build not just for themselves, but for a future they'll never see, trusting that the systems and institutions they create will continue to serve human needs long after the individuals who created them are gone. The first major test of this new approach comes when a coalition of communities decides to undertake the most ambitious environmental modification project in human history. They're going to redirect a major river system to create reliable water access for a dozen allied settlements, while simultaneously creating new wetland habitats that will support the waterfowl and fish populations their people depend on for protein. The project requires coordination between groups that have never worked together directly, sharing of specialized knowledge that some communities consider proprietary secrets, and resource commitments that will strain everyone involved. More challenging still, it requires maintaining cooperation and momentum over multiple seasons, something no human society has ever attempted on this scale. The engineering challenges alone would be daunting for modern societies with advanced tools and scientific knowledge. Your ancestors are attempting to move massive amounts of earth and stone using nothing but human labor, wooden tools, and the kind of innovative problem solving that comes from having no choice but to succeed or watch everything they've built collapse around them. They develop techniques for moving large rocks that involve coordinated lifting by dozens of individuals working in perfect synchronization. They create systems for transporting earth that maximize efficiency while minimizing the physical strain on workers who must sustain this effort over months. Most impressively, they design the entire project to be implemented in stages that provide immediate benefits to participating communities while building toward the larger goal. But the technical challenges pale in comparison to the social and political complexities of managing such a massive cooperative undertaking. Different communities have different ideas about project priorities, resource allocation, and acceptable risk levels. Disputes arise over everything from work schedules to food distribution for project workers. Some groups begin questioning whether the promised benefits justify the enormous costs they're being asked to bear. Your ancestors' response to these challenges demonstrates just how sophisticated their understanding of human psychology and social dynamics has become. Instead of trying to impose solutions from above, they develop mechanisms that allow different communities to negotiate their own agreements while maintaining their commitment to the overall project. They create rotating leadership structures that ensure no single group dominates decision-making processes. Most importantly, they establish clear protocols for withdrawing from the project if conditions change or if the costs become unbearable for individual communities. The flexibility built into these arrangements proves crucial when unexpected challenges arise. A seasonal flood destroys months of work on one section of the project. A disease outbreak reduces the available workforce from several communities. Political tensions between two allied groups threaten to split the coalition at a critical moment in the construction timeline. Each crisis tests the resilience of the cooperative institutions your ancestors have created, and each successful resolution strengthens the bonds between participating communities. They're learning that building civilizations requires not just the ability to work together when everything goes according to plan, but the wisdom to maintain cooperation when plans fail and new solutions must be improvised under pressure. The project's completion, after nearly 2 full seasonal cycles of sustained effort, marks a watershed moment in human social evolution. Your ancestors have proven that they can coordinate complex undertakings that require sustained cooperation between multiple communities over extended periods. They've demonstrated that human intelligence and determination can overcome environmental challenges that would have forced previous generations to abandon their territories and start over elsewhere. But perhaps most significantly, they've created something that transcends immediate survival needs. The modified river system they've built will continue to provide benefits for generations, long after the individuals who designed and constructed it are gone. They've learned to build for the future, not just for themselves, and that shift in perspective will influence every subsequent development in human civilization. The success of this massive cooperative project triggers a wave of similar undertakings throughout the region. Communities that initially doubted the feasibility of large-scale environmental modification begin developing their own ambitious projects. The techniques and social innovations pioneered by your ancestors' coalition spread rapidly as other groups adapt these methods to their own circumstances and challenges. Within just a few generations, the entire landscape of prehistoric Africa begins to show the effects of systematic human environmental management. Forests are selectively modified to increase their productivity for human communities while maintaining their ecological functions. Grasslands are managed to optimize their ability to support both wild game and human settlements. Water systems are engineered to provide reliable access while preventing the flooding and drought cycles that previously made large-scale settlement impossible. Your ancestors are transforming from a species that adapts to environmental conditions into one that shapes those conditions to serve human needs. But they're doing so in ways that work with natural systems rather than against them, creating modified environments that are often more productive and stable than the unmanaged ecosystems they replaced. This approach to environmental management reflects a sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships that won't be formally recognized by human science for millions of years. Your ancestors have learned through direct observation and careful experimentation that human activities can enhance rather than degrade natural systems if those activities are planned and implemented with sufficient knowledge and restraint. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond environmental management. Your ancestors are learning that they can apply the same principles of systematic observation, careful planning, and coordinated implementation to virtually any challenge they face. They're developing what amounts to a scientific method for solving complex problems, though they wouldn't recognize it by that name. This systematic approach to problem solving begins to influence every aspect of human society. Toolmaking evolves from individual craftsmanship to coordinated research and development programs involving multiple specialists working together to improve designs and techniques. Hunting strategies become increasingly sophisticated as different communities share observations about animal behavior and coordinate their efforts to maximize success while minimizing environmental impact. Most remarkably, your ancestors begin applying systematic thinking to the challenge of human social organization itself. They start experimenting with different forms of leadership, decision-making processes, and conflict resolution mechanisms, carefully observing the results and making adjustments based on what they learn. These experiments in social engineering produce innovations that will influence human civilization for millions of years. They develop representative systems that allow large communities to make collective decisions without requiring everyone to participate directly in every discussion. They create specialized roles for individuals with particular skills or knowledge, leading to the first professional classes in human society. They establish formal procedures for training young people in essential skills and knowledge, creating the foundations of education systems. But perhaps most importantly, they learn to think about human society as something that can be deliberately improved rather than simply endured. They begin viewing social problems not as inevitable aspects of human nature, but as challenges that can be solved through careful analysis, creative thinking, and coordinated effort. This shift from accepting social conditions to actively working to improve them represents the final transformation that turns your ancestors from successful survivors into the builders of civilization. They've learned not just to adapt to the world they find themselves in, but to create the world they want to live in. The giants they once feared are gone, driven to extinction by environmental changes and human expansion. But the qualities that allowed your ancestors to survive those ancient battles, the intelligence, courage, and capacity for cooperation that saw them through humanity's darkest hours, continue to drive them toward achievements that would have been unimaginable when they first stood upright in that prehistoric forest. They've won the war for survival, but in doing so, they've discovered something even more valuable than victory. They've learned that human beings, working together with sufficient wisdom and determination, can build something better than mere survival. They can build a future worthy of the struggles that made it possible. The story that began with frightened primates hiding from saber-toothed predators has become the foundation myth of human civilization itself. A reminder that every challenge we face, no matter how overwhelming it might seem, has been faced before by people with fewer resources, but equal courage. Their triumph over the giants of prehistory wasn't just about survival. It was about proving that intelligence, cooperation, and stubborn refusal to accept defeat can overcome any obstacle the world places in our path. The echoes of that ancient triumph still reverberate through time. But your ancestors' greatest challenge wasn't behind them. It was just beginning. Because while they'd learned to defeat the giants of their world, they were about to discover something that would test every innovation, every alliance, every hard-won survival skill they'd developed. The giants were gone, but nature itself was about to unleash something far more devastating than any creature with fangs and claws. The first tremors began on what seemed like an ordinary morning. Your people had grown accustomed to the subtle vibrations that announced the approach of large animals, but this was different, deeper, more persistent. The ground itself seemed to be awakening from some ancient slumber, and what it brought with it would reshape not just the landscape, but the entire future of human civilization. volcanic activity on a scale that defies modern comprehension was beginning to tear apart the African continent. We're not talking about a single mountain exploding in a dramatic but localized catastrophe. This was the birth of the Great Rift Valley System, a geological convulsion that would split Africa like a massive axe blow, creating new mountains, new deserts, and fundamentally altering the climate patterns that your ancestors had learned to predict and manage. The environmental modifications your people had so carefully engineered, those river diversions and forest management systems that represented generations of coordinated effort, began failing as the very bedrock beneath them shifted and cracked. Springs that had provided reliable water for countless seasons suddenly dried up as underground aquifers were disrupted by seismic activity. The carefully maintained clearings where allied communities gathered for trade and diplomacy found themselves bisected by newly formed ravines that made travel dangerous and communication nearly impossible. Your ancestors watched in growing alarm as their sophisticated social networks began fragmenting under pressures no human society had ever faced. Communities that had cooperated seamlessly for generations found themselves cut off from each other by geological barriers that appeared almost overnight. The trade routes that had allowed specialized communities to exchange resources and knowledge became impassable as familiar landmarks disappeared beneath landslides or emerged as jagged new mountain ranges. But here's where the story takes a turn that reveals the true measure of what your ancestors had become. Instead of fragmenting into isolated groups that abandoned everything they'd built, they did something unprecedented in the natural world. They began adapting their entire civilization to accommodate geological change on a continental scale. The response they developed required every innovation they'd pioneered in social organization, environmental management, and cooperative problem solving. But it also demanded something new, something that would define human civilization for the rest of its existence. They had to learn to maintain cultural continuity and shared identity across geographical barriers that would have permanently separated any previous human society. The solution they developed was elegant in its simplicity and revolutionary in its implications. If physical travel between communities was becoming impossible, they would create new forms of communication that could cross the growing rifts and mountain ranges. They began developing systems of signals using fire, smoke, and reflected sunlight that could carry complex messages across distances that would have taken weeks to travel on foot. More importantly, they established protocols for maintaining their alliance networks, even when direct contact became impossible. Different communities took responsibility for preserving specific aspects of shared knowledge and cultural practices, creating a distributed system that ensured crucial information wouldn't be lost even if individual settlements were destroyed or cut off from the larger network. Young people were trained not just in the skills their own communities needed, but in the specialized knowledge of allied groups they might never be able to visit. This created a generation of individuals who carried the accumulated wisdom of multiple communities, serving as living libraries that could preserve and transmit cultural knowledge even under the most challenging conditions. The geological upheaval also forced your ancestors to confront questions about human identity and belonging that had never been relevant when communities could maintain regular contact with their allies. What did it mean to be part of a larger human society when that society was being physically torn apart by forces beyond anyone's control? How could shared values and cooperative institutions survive when the communities that created them were separated by impassable barriers? The answers your people developed to these challenges established principles that would influence human civilization for millions of years. They learned that cultural identity could transcend geographical boundaries, that shared values could be maintained through storytelling and ritual even when regular contact was impossible, and that human societies could remain connected through bonds of mutual obligation and common purpose, even when physical interaction became rare or dangerous. But perhaps most importantly, they discovered that adversity on this scale could actually strengthen rather than weaken human cooperation, if that cooperation was based on deep enough foundations of trust, and shared commitment. The communities that maintained their alliance bonds despite geological separation found ways to support each other that were more sophisticated and reliable than the simpler resource-sharing arrangements that had worked when regular contact was possible. They developed systems of mutual insurance that allowed communities facing local disasters to call upon distant allies for assistance, even when direct communication was difficult. They established protocols for coordinating responses to threats that affected multiple separated communities simultaneously. Most remarkably, they created mechanisms for maintaining technological and cultural innovation across their dispersed network, ensuring that improvements developed by one community could eventually benefit all their allies. The success of these adaptations had effects that reached far beyond immediate survival needs. Your ancestors were learning that human societies could be more resilient and adaptable than the environments that shaped them, that cultural evolution could proceed faster than geological change, and that intelligence and cooperation could overcome even the most fundamental alterations to the physical world. This realization transformed their relationship with their environment from reactive adaptation to proactive management. Instead of simply responding to environmental changes as they occurred, your people began developing strategies for anticipating and preparing for future challenges. They started thinking systematically about long-term trends and their implications for human society, creating the foundations of what would eventually become science, technology, and systematic planning for societal development. The volcanic activity that was reshaping their continent also created new opportunities that your ancestors learned to exploit with characteristic ingenuity. The ash and lava that destroyed existing ecosystems also created incredibly fertile soils that could support much more intensive agriculture than anything they'd previously attempted. The new mountain ranges that cut off traditional trade routes also created microclimates that allowed cultivation of plants that had never grown in the region before. Your people began experimenting with deliberate agriculture on a scale that would have been unimaginable just generations earlier. They learned to work with volcanic soils to create productive farmland that could support much larger populations than hunting and gathering alone. They developed techniques for managing water in the new landscape, creating irrigation systems that took advantage of the changed topography to bring reliable water supplies to areas that had previously been too dry for permanent settlement. But these agricultural innovations required new forms of social organization that pushed human cooperation to entirely new levels of complexity. Successful farming demanded year-round commitment to specific locations, long-term planning that extended across multiple growing seasons, and coordination between specialists with different types of knowledge and skills. Your ancestors' journey from terrified prey to masters of their world represents the greatest transformation in Earth's history. They began as small, vulnerable creatures hiding from saber-toothed nightmares, and through sheer determination, intelligence, and cooperation, they became the architects of civilization itself. Every challenge they faced, from Macaridus to Dinotherium, from rival human groups to continental geological upheaval, they met with innovation and unbreakable unity. The giants are gone, extinct and forgotten. But the courage, ingenuity, and stubborn refusal to surrender that allowed your ancestors to defeat them lives on in every human achievement that followed. Their legacy isn't just survival, it's proof that no obstacle is insurmountable when intelligence meets determination.